All right. Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to another future-focused weekly update where I am hopefully helping keep you 10 steps ahead of the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. Let's see, what do I got? So first of all, thanks to all of you who have subscribed and followed my stuff. I just got my Spotify Wrapped. And some pretty awesome stats here. I won't sit and run through those, but it's been awesome to watch the podcast grow this year and all that good stuff. And so if you're new to this, I hope you find it helpful. If you've been following for a while in 2024, thank you so much. I'd ask anybody who finds value in it, please share it with your friend, leave it a review, rating, comment, all that good stuff. I always appreciate it. And feel free to share things with me that you think are interesting or would like my perspective on. With that, I want to give a little bit of context to where I'm going this week, because I know last week was a slight deviation. This one's a little bit of a deviation. And then, I've got already a list of things that I'll be covering next week. But this week in particular, if you followed me for very long, every once in a while, Stephen Bartlett does a Diary of a CEO episode that particularly captures my attention. And I record responses to them when I think they're ones that are of particular interest and fit my flavor of what really grabs my attention. And he recently interviewed, this was back on November 14th, so it's been a few weeks, but he recently interviewed Eric Schmidt, who was the former CEO of Google. He's now moved on and he does a bunch of other stuff. And so this was one of those conversations that I actually almost felt fit even better than some of the other DOAC episodes I've responded to, where they've been really primarily just about AI. This one actually touched on business, technology, and human experience, all three of them. And there's a lot to it. It's an hour and a half long interview, so I'm not going to sit and go through every single thing. I've watched it several times, and what I did is I broke it into those three sections, so business, technology, and human experience. And there were aspects of it that I thought were extremely interesting, but I had something that I would add or context I would give from my perspective, or they were things that I really want to emphasize what's brought up here. So I decided to zoom in on those, and I think there's like 9 or 10 of them that I thought were particularly interesting. So if you haven't watched one of these before, I will bring clips in from the episode, so you get to hear another voice other than mine a little bit, but then they're going to be relatively short, and then I'll just cut them off and then respond to those. So that's the plan for this one. So let's start with this. And like I said, I'm going to focus into the three different areas. So we're going to start with the business one. And if you listen, I will tell you this, if you listen to the whole thing, which it's a good interview, so it's worth an hour and a half of your time if you want. Otherwise, you can just listen to my response. But it's a little bit all over the place. So if you listen to it, you're going to find they jump all over. So if you watch these clips, you're going to be like, I'm not following a sequential order, because if I did, it would be all over the place. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to provide some structure to it. So the first one that I wanted to touch on was something that he brought up related to strategy. So I'm going to touch on this one real quick here, because he talks about business strategy in a really unique way that I'll add some other things that also came out in the interview. So let me bring this one up.
What about business plans? Should we be writing business plans as founders?
Google wrote a business plan. It was run by a fellow named Salar. And I saw it years later, and it was actually correct. And I told Salar that this is probably the only business plan ever written for a corporation that was actually correct in hindsight. So what I prefer to do, and this is how I teach it at Stanford, is try to figure out what the world looks like in 5 years, and then try to figure out what you're going to do in 1 year, and then do it, right? So if you can basically say, this is the direction, these are the things we're going to achieve within 1 year, and then run against that as hard goals, not simple goals, but hard goals, then you'll get there. And the general rule, at least in a consumer business, is if you can get an audience of 10 or 100 million people, you can make lots of money, right? So if you...
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. But the point that I wanted to bring out of this one in particular is that again, I think was really interesting in his point about business strategy, is this whole idea, if you talk to people, if you have been involved with setting corporate strategies, things like that, you will see this a lot, where a lot of strategies just completely fall apart. And you can even see some of the shock in what he says in there. And he was surprised that Google's strategy was there. And I thought this idea of thinking about things in terms of 5 years, but really focusing on the one, is extremely valuable. But when he goes deeper into it, and I think this is the bigger thing, because oftentimes you'll see people look and they go, 5 years, we can't possibly think where we're going to be in 5 years. But actually, you can if you're looking at it through the right lens. And I think that's where a lot of strategy falls apart, is people are looking at it at this granular micro lens and trying to figure out, well, what are we going to be doing in 5 years? And it's like, well, of course you're not going to be able to assess what you're going to be doing in 5 years. But if you look at the macro trajectory of where we're going economically, from a business standpoint, things like that, then you actually can start to do that. And from there, you can start to deconstruct the kinds of things that you anticipate you may be doing. And you can get pretty good at anticipating where things were over the course of, for sure, a year with kind of a 5-year strat. And I say that from experience, in that, let's just reflect back on my time at ChenMed. I was there for about 4 years. The strategy that I put in place when I joined, we actually executed on it, and it was right. It was exactly on par with what needed to happen. Now, if you were to look at, well, Christopher, the projects your teams were working on and the things you didn't have that in your strategy. And it's like, of course I didn't. It was an enterprise multi-year strat. I had to think about where the business was today. What are some of the macroeconomics of what's happening in healthcare? What are some of the dynamics of where technology is going? And granted, did some of those things pivot fairly significantly? Yeah, I didn't see Gen AI blowing up like it did in 2022, but I was watching what had happened with the pandemic and how people were shifting their attitudes towards work and where the world was going and how technology was evolving. So while I didn't know specifically, Gen AI is going to blow up in 2022 and that's going to radically change things, I didn't need to know that specific thing to be able to go, so these are going to be the big strategic initiatives and things we're going to focus on over the next 5 years. And then drilling into that within a year, it actually was relatively predictable. And so I love the fact he talked about that approach to strategy, because it is possible, and I've done it, and I've helped others do it. And so I think that is something that organizations can do a much better job of, because I don't always see them doing it that well. Or like I said, they'll look 5 years and then they try and predict what are the specific initiatives or projects we're going to have running. And it's like, well, those are going to constantly be moving, but the North Stars, the direction, those really do not change with the kind of, uncertainty that a lot of the other stuff does. So I thought that was a really good takeaway for folks who are trying to think about strategy. And you know what? Sometimes you need help. You need somebody who has that broader macro lens, and that's not a bad thing. I think sometimes we're afraid to ask for help and we think we have to know all the details. I think consultants sometimes get a bad rap because it's like, oh, consultants this. It's like, well, what are you using them for? And how are you, because trying to keep up with all that stuff is impossible. I mean, that's why I think a lot of you, at least the people who've shared with me, that's why a lot of you follow my stuff, because you don't have the time or capacity to sit and pay attention to all the details. So you need somebody to go, here's what you should be paying attention to or what it means so that you can consider that. So I thought that was really interesting. Another one that I thought was interesting, I don't know, I had something to say and I didn't bring up this clip, but there's a part in there where he talks about understanding competition. And in it, he specifically says, pay no attention to the competition. Just focus on what you do, and who cares what your competition's doing. And there's a lot of, and I think if I were to sit down, and this is the thing with it, whenever I watch one of those DOAC episodes, I'm always like, I wish I was in the room, or I wish I had that same conversation, because there are things I would want to go deeper with. Because I actually think Eric and I would probably agree with this more. On the surface, if you respond to that, you would think he's saying, who cares what anybody else is doing? Follow your heart and just go. And that's not, I don't think at all, that's what he's saying. What he's getting at, and I see this a lot, especially when I work with tech companies, is everybody's trying to look at everybody else's like business strat and their competitive advantages and trying to do all this and then going like, how do we compete with that? And how do we compete with that? Instead of going, what did we set out to do? And are we being the absolute best at what we set out to do? And I'm not going to worry if somebody else is, doing a slightly different version of that, or they're going in a slightly different direction, because that will kill your strategy. It will kill your success if you go that way with it. But what I think he's not getting at, or the part that I would caution people, if you listen to this, you could miss, is it doesn't mean you don't need to understand your market or understand your customers' pain points. And I see that mistake made all the time, because people take this follow your heart approach, where it's like, well, I believe this is a problem, so I'm going to go for it. And I see this with tech startups, where I'll meet and talk with their product teams or their exec team members, and they're like, we have this great idea. And even our customers might say, yeah, but why won't they buy it? And I'm like, well, how much do you really know about their pain point? Or, just because they're giving you a nod or an industry report said this is a thing, do you actually understand the pain that they're experiencing? And if so, like, do you really know what that means? Because I don't think you do if you're having that kind of gap. So I think that was the only thing that I was a little like, I think I agree with Eric. And I think there's more to the story that he didn't necessarily come out in the interview. Okay. So next, I want to jump to his take on innovation, which I thought was interesting. So he talks about how to structure teams to drive innovation here.
Is it possible for a team to innovate while they still have their day job, which is harvesting, if you know what I mean? Or do you have to take those people, put them into a different team, different building, different P&L, and get them to focus on their disruptive innovation?
There are almost no examples of doing it simultaneously in the same building. The Macintosh was famously, Steve, in his typical crazy way, had this very small team that invented the Macintosh, and he put them in a little building next to the big building on Bub Road and Cupertino. And they put a pirate flag on top of it. Now, was that good culturally inside the company? No, because it created resentment in the big building. But was it right in terms of the revenue and path of Apple? Absolutely.
Why?
Because.
So I'll stop it there. If you want, like I said, if you want to watch it, you can go watch the whole thing. And here was kind of my thoughts, reactions to this, because I hear what he's getting at. My experience has been slightly different, but it might be nuanced here. So this whole example of Apple and having this pirate flag, and the fact he said innovation cannot exist within, the functions. Where I agree with what he's getting at there is, and this is where a lot of companies fail, is they're like, we want everybody to be an innovator. Innovation should come from all of us. And the reality is, one, a lot of people struggle with that in general. And two, you actually as a company don't want everybody constantly innovating. There is something to be said about keeping the wheels turning. I mean, the business is running. You need people to keep that focus, and that consumes a lot of people's time and attention. And you don't necessarily want them taking their eye off the ball to go experiment with these crazy things out here that, might end up really disrupting it. Here's where I struggle with it's not possible. And I think that was the part that I was like, oh, I don't know if I fully agree with that. But then there's also this change management side. So as I've led teams over the years, one of the things I've always been really intentional about is I do want a percentage of my teams, everyone on my team's time, focused on innovating. But it's not necessarily like what Eric is describing here of Steve Jobs in this building with the pirate flag of like the completely outside the box new business ideas. When I'm tasking my team with a portion of their time on innovating, I'm like, in the world you're in, where do you see pain? Where do you see things that are like, gosh, it should be better, it could be better, things like that. I want you dedicating time to that and finding ways to go, what could we do differently about it? Not necessarily reinventing things or coming up with completely outside the box things. And if that's what Eric's getting at, then I do agree. And I have always had what I called my incubator group. There were specific people and functions within my teams that were dedicated to shattering the status quo. Like, you're going to do things that are going to fail radically. And I'm just banking on that. That was something that I agree. You can't just say, everybody do that. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And I agree with Eric on that. What I wouldn't want people interpreting from that is never, you have this group of people who challenge, and then you have a group of people, you never want them to think outside the box or do things differently. You just want them heads down doing their day-to-day. And the reason for that, my experience has been, what can happen if you're not careful with this is if you completely isolate innovation to a specific team, what will end up happening is that team will come up with sometimes the greatest ideas that have ever, been heard or thought of. And then when it comes time to implement, it just falls flat. And it falls flat because the rest of the organization is like so resistant to innovation. They don't have any of the muscles. All the muscles around innovation have atrophied, and they've completely forgotten how they have become so uncomfortable with change. They just literally don't know what to do with it. And so there has to be that lightweight lifting routine of innovation with everybody, so that when new innovation comes, the body doesn't reject the organ. I think it also has to do a lot with the change management. My experience has been like timing and when do you bring people in is a really, really important component. And if you don't time that right, it will fall apart. And he doesn't talk about that at all. But that to me is one of the biggest misses I see with this whole, like, you have the pirate ship idea. And I've been in companies and have worked with leaders who they've kind of tried to adopt that Steve Jobs thing, and it's failed colossally. So that's the thing that I worry about when I see people watching, stuff like this, and they just hear, oh, great, let's build a building with a pirate flag. It might destroy our culture. It might, cause absolute chaos, but Steve Jobs did it and it worked. And it's like, well, there was a whole lot more going on behind the scenes. And you also had the full executive buy-in there, that when the Mac OS was created, it was like, we're doing this from the senior, like they weren't selling it. It was like, this is what's happening because Steve was behind it. So there's more to the story with that. Like I said, I think what Eric gets at is accurate. I think there's a lot of truth in what he said, but there's always the nuance alongside it. Okay, so this next one has to do with culture. And so I want to talk about his point on culture here.
In terms of company culture and how important that is for the success and prospects of a company, well, how do you think about company culture and how significant and important is it? And when and who sets it?
So it's almost always set, company cultures are almost always set by the founders. I happen to be on the board of the Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic is the largest healthcare system in America. It's also the most highly rated one. And they have a rule, which is called the needs of the customer come first, which came out of the Mayo brothers, who've been dead for like 120 years. But that was their principle. And when I initially got on the board, I started wandering around. I thought, this is kind of a stupid phrase, and nobody really does this. And they really believe it, and they repeat it, and they repeat it, right? So it's true in non-technical cultures. In that case, it's a healthcare for service delivery. You can drive a culture even in non-tech. In tech, it's typically an engineering culture. And
okay, so here he gets a little more into the weeds on, tech culture and this and that. But what I really wanted to focus on was this point about culture, and that it's created by the founders and sticks, and it's, I think, in many ways led at the top. And I'll see these culture war battles go on in LinkedIn and stuff like this, where people are arguing about, culture comes from the top, no, it comes from the bottom, and all this other stuff. Again, I think where I agree with what he's getting at here is that, this is why a lot of culture change initiatives fail, is because despite the fact maybe the founders or the company has been operating on this cultural, methodology, and this has been the culture forever, somebody comes in and goes, you know what, we're going to change the culture, and we're going to think, we used to walk to the left, Now we're going to walk to the right. And it fails. And a lot of times it has to do with the fact that there is just some sort of blood in the culture that you can't clean. You can't get rid of it completely. And this is where companies completely underestimate the immense effort that goes into culture change. Now, have I seen companies change the culture? Yes. So the caveat I would add to what he says is, it's not that you can't change culture. If there's toxic stuff happening in your culture, you can't just go, well, that's just the way our culture is. The founders were complete draconian jerks, and that's the leadership culture we had, and that's the way we treat people, and this is how we think about things, and that's just what it will be. I think this kind of advice can be dangerous in that you can kind of create this environment where you go, well, the culture is what the culture is, and so there's nothing you can do about it. That's not the case, but there is something to the fact that culture does largely come from the top, and it isn't easy to change. So if you really are going to change it, it's not something you come out, you bring in a branding agency and slap some new slides together and go, ta-da, like this is you really truly have to deconstruct what is the culture? Why does the culture exist? What are the things pushing towards that culture? I mean, yeah, Mayo Clinic, I have some good friends who are on the leadership team there. There is very much a patient-centric culture. So if somebody came in and said, we're going to be employee-centric and just that's going to translate to patients, even though I think that would be a good approach, that's not going to happen overnight because you'd have to deconstruct what's really going on there. And so I would just caution people with that. But I also would say to leaders who might go, here's my advice to people who might be in a company where the culture isn't exactly what they want. Don't think that means there's nothing you can do about it. I've been in organizations where my leadership style, the way I run my teams, the way I run my orgs was in stark contrast to the company culture. And we were cutting against the grain all the time. And we did it. And you can go talk to anybody who's ever worked for me and say, did you ever work under Christopher and what was that culture like? Did he just adopt? You can have subcultures. And I think that's very much a thing, but it requires a lot of effort. And so it also requires a leader who's fully bought into what that is and knows what they're, stepping into. And so to leaders out there, if you are in an organization that maybe doesn't have the healthiest culture, what I'd say is don't just throw your hands in the air and go, well, Christopher or Eric Schmidt says the culture is driven by this and there's nothing you can do about it. That I would completely vehemently disagree with. And I would say that's BS. That's lazy leadership, saying, well, I just perpetuate this toxic culture because that's the way we operate. You don't have to do that. And it is possible to cut against that and to demonstrate a radically different culture in your teams. And I would encourage people to when it's not healthy. To the people who may be at this state where you're like, but I don't have a leader that's doing this. I wish it was different. I've tried, I'm doing there is a point where, to his point, if you really don't fit the culture, it's okay to leave and not to hold on to this hope that maybe the culture will change. Maybe the organization, if the culture of the company is in stark contrast to who you are, or you just hate the culture you're in, don't subject yourself to that indefinitely on the hopes that maybe the new CEO, we got a new CEO. I bet the company culture will change. It won't. And I think I have coached many people over the years where I'm like, you need to get out. The company you're in it's not healthy. It's not good for you. And the best thing you can do is actually leave. Now, the other thing that I think he spent some time on that I thought was really good was he did talk about, I think they had these TGF Fridays, and they used to do them where the execs would come up front and they would just answer any questions and get into all these details. And then they had to stop doing them. And it was because somebody was live streaming the event. One thing he did acknowledge, and I think this is something over the years I've had to deal with myself and I've helped a lot of senior leaders with. As companies get bigger, there is truth in the fact that you do have to change what it looks like to be transparent. You do have to change what it means to be vulnerable. You do have to change what that looks like. And so I think sometimes people will poke holes in companies and go, the C-suite execs, like they don't tell us anything. And it's like, well, that's unreasonable. Maybe you came from a startup environment and the CEO told you everything about what they're doing. And you're like, now I'm at Google or GE and it's not that way. And it should be. And it's like, his description describes why it can't. And I completely agree that has to shift. Where I would caution senior leaders is you can buy into that mindset and go, oh, so therefore we throw out these attributes instead of going, we have to think about them differently. So if vulnerability and transparency and accountability, like those are core values of your organization as a startup, and that showed up as telling everybody everything in the beginning, being wildly transparent, letting people in on all your financial data in the early days. As you grow, you might have to go, now people are more disconnected. We don't have the same we might have to reevaluate it, but it doesn't mean we throw those values out the window. And I think that's one of the things that I would reinforce coming off of, reviewing his is like, be careful with that because you can go too far with it. Okay. The last one I have on business has to do with the remote work, which I thought was I actually really love this one, which may surprise some folks. So let me pull this one up. And, as they get into it, let me give some context because I'm not playing the whole thing. So Steven asks Eric, he goes, this used to be contrarian. I was a big believer in, being in the office, sharing space, doing all this stuff. And so I have pushed that with my own company, my own teams. I'm a firm believer in it. Eric kind of comes in and agrees with it. And so let me play it from here.
Is robbing them of something which I think is important. This was a contrarian view. It's become less contrarian as the big tech companies in America have started to roll back some of their initial knee-jerk reactions to the pandemic. A lot of them are asking their team members to come back into the office at least a couple of days a week. What's your point of view on this?
So I have a strong view that I want people in an office. It doesn't have to be all one office, but I want them in an office. And partly it's for their own benefit. If you're in your 20s, when I was a young executive, I knew nothing of what I was doing. I literally was just lucky to be there. And I learned by hanging out at the water cooler, going to meetings, hanging out, being in the hallway. Had I been at home, I wouldn't have had any of that knowledge, which ultimately was central to my subsequent promotions. So if you're in your 20s, you want to be in an office because that's how you're going to get promoted. And I think that's consistent with the majority of the people who really want to work from home have honest problems with commuting and family and so forth. They're real issues. The problem with our joint view is it's not supported by the data. The data indicates that productivity is actually slightly higher in work when you allow work from home. So you and I really want that company of people sitting around the table and so forth, but the evidence does not support our view.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Is that true?
It is absolutely true.
Why is...
Okay, so I love this. I really, really love this. And again, not because, see, gotcha. I loved Eric's honesty about this. And this is one of my biggest challenges with people who push back on remote hybrid work is it's often this, no, because it's better, it's more productive, it's all these other things. And Eric, former CEO of Google, openly acknowledges the data says otherwise. The data is, as much as I wish it didn't, the data is there. And I think when you can acknowledge that, it allows you to have a better conversation. Because here's the thing, his point about being in your 20s, here's what I saw as I listened to both of them talk about this. Both of them have their own experiences that has shaped how they have achieved some of the things that they have. And so they've attributed their experiences to what led to that. And you hear this with Eric as he goes, well, when you're in your 20s, you get this. And what I actually hear him saying is, when I was in my 20s, that's what I got. Therefore, I attribute that to my success. But he doesn't say that. And I think it's because I don't even know that he necessarily realizes that was your personal experience. And it is completely possible for somebody to have a radically different experience and achieve the same outcomes, which is why the data shows it's possible. And I think this is where people assume that I think any company that has people come into the office is like ridiculous. And I don't. What I have an issue with is when they go, no, it's because it drives it's better. And it's like, it's not better. It's a preference. And you know what? to Stephen and Eric, if that's what their preference is, so be it. So long as you acknowledge our preference is actually at the expense of some of these other things that we also say are important. And we're thinking through how are we countering those, because we're losing productivity. We're losing engagement. So what are we doing to compensate for those instead of going, no, this gives us that when the data says otherwise? And I think this is where we just need to spend more time objectively talking about what really is going on here and how do we solve this in a meaningful way? Because you know what, and I've been in situations with this where I've worked with senior execs where they go, I just can't get past this. This is where I am. And I've said, that's okay. So then let's talk about what that looks like. And maybe, again, going back to the culture point, maybe we need to talk about what your culture is. And there are going to be some people that you just need to say, this is not the place for you because it's not going to work for you. And you might have to have a different hiring pro. And you need to accept that that is a trade-off of you preferring this. And just acknowledge that and say, the data shows this, therefore my preference towards this is that. I mean, think about this. I know there are certain things that I like to eat that aren't necessarily healthy for me, right? I love apple pie around Thanksgiving. The last few nights I've had apple pie for dinner. That's been my dinner. A nutritionist would say, Christopher, that's terrible. You're not getting the vitamins you need. You're not getting, and I'm like, I know, I don't care, and I counterbalance that by not doing that all year long and things like that. But I don't go into it, nuh-uh, apple pie is fruit and fruit is healthy. And therefore I can have apple pie all year long because I like apple pie and I think apple pie is healthy. Like you're not living in an objective reality when you do that. And I think that's where we need to have more conversations on the reality of things. And that's why I appreciated him going, I wish it was true that this is a better model to operate. The data doesn't support it. And so that then leads to having a more productive conversation that I think we need more of those. So I enjoyed it. And I can even have a better conversation with an Eric Schmidt because he recognizes that. And then it's like, well, so then let's figure out the outcomes and figure out how we drive that and what that looks like. So that is where I landed on the, so looking at that is what I came up with for the business side. Those were the business pieces that really stood out to me that I thought were really notable or where I wanted to add additional clarity. So I want to transition now to the technology pieces because they do talk a lot about technology throughout this. One of the things, I'm not going to pull up the clip from it, but, they talk a lot about, Eric openly says, and this is to me why AI is such a significant thing. He talks about the fact this is one of the macro changes that changes everything. It's like the internet. It's like electricity. And I completely agree with that. I've said that for a long time for that very reason that, it's not like in the example he uses. I think it was a great illustration. He's like, this isn't like cryptocurrency, or VR, where people go, this is going to change the world. It's like, no, it's big, it's innovative, it's significant, it will have big implications, but it's not an everything kind of change. And, AI is. And so similar to the work from home, it's like, you have to approach the conversation differently and think about it differently. So I thought that was really valuable. But really one of the things I thought was interesting was this section on the societal changes and incorporating AI into things. So let me play this clip right here that has some of the stuff in here.
Am I going to have to interface with this technology? Am I going to have to get a neural link in my brain? Because you go over the subject of there being these sort of two species of humans potentially, ones that do have a way to incorporate themselves more with artificial intelligence and those that don't. And if that is the case, what is the time horizon in your view of that happening?
I think Neuralink is much more speculative because you're dealing with direct brain connection, and nobody's going to drill on my brain until it needs it. Trust me. Mm-hmm. I suspect you feel the same. I guess my overall view is that you will not notice how much of your world has been co-opted by these technologies because they will produce greater delight. If you think about it, a lot of life is inconvenient. It's fix this, call this, make this happen. AI systems should make all that seamless. You should be able to wake up in the morning and have coffee and not have a care in the world and have the computer.
Okay, so I'm gonna pause there for two reasons. I mean, one, he goes on for quite a bit. So again, you can check it out if you want to see it. But here's the things that I really wanted to double tap on with this that are, I think, essential for people to think about with this. Is I just talked about the fact, and he talks about it like AI is going to be one of these macro, complete societal changes that hits everything. And I agree with that. But what is really notable that he points out there that I think we have to be aware of, that I don't think enough people are paying attention to, is the way it's shaping and the way it's influencing and the way it's affecting your life. It's not going to be something you necessarily notice. And I think that is actually one of the most dangerous parts of it. Going back to that analogy of what is it? If you throw a frog into boiling water, they'll jump right out. But if you put a frog in water and then you heat it up, they'll just sit there and cook themselves. Now, I've never tried it, so I don't know if that's true or not. But the analogy stands that I think is one of the biggest concerns, is that we don't fully understand how much AI is, as he said, co-opting what the future looks like. And so as a result, we think we're in control, or we think we have an idea of where it's going, or we're watching out for these big macro, humanoid robots to show up at our house. And we watch for those things instead of going, wait, though, where is it subtly influencing and changing things in ways we don't anticipate or we are not paying attention to? And that's one of the things, if you followed my stuff for long, I talk a lot about some of these examples. Even some of the things I talked about recently with, couples are using AI to help inform the way they have conflict, the way kids are interacting, which is something I'll talk about later with you. There's all this, the way our news feeds are curated. We see this with social media, the way information comes to us, all these subtle changes that we aren't really paying attention to. And the part that I think we have to be so much more intentional about paying attention to this is, he talks about co-opting, and in his mind, and his words were, so much of life is whatever, not enjoyable or whatever. The part that's concerning that I think we need to be so careful of is someone else is making those decisions for you and you don't even realize it. And that's the concerning part to me. One of the biggest concerning parts about AI is someone else is deciding what is inconvenient or convenient for you. Someone else is deciding what you enjoy or don't enjoy. And they're slowly changing your environment around you based on what someone else decides is important or what someone else thinks your attention should be focused on. And it's taking away from you things they don't think are that important to you. Now, again, is it something that there's just no way to avoid it? No. But you have to be that much more intentional and focused on things, because if you don't, you won't even see these changes happening. And before you know it, you thought you were facing east and now you're facing west, and you have no idea how you got there. And it's because of this stuff that is happening. And I think this is one of the things that he touches on it in a very positive way, which he admits he's an optimist. And I am too, but I don't think he fully acknowledges and represents, which he's been involved in the big tech sphere. And again, everybody, all of us, and this is one of the problems, all of us think we know what's better for everybody else. We are all collectively really bad at this. We think we know what other people need, and if they just did this, and if they just focused on these things and all this stuff. So now you have big tech companies who are creating technology that is seeping its way into every aspect of our life, that is controlled and influenced by people who go, you know what? These people would just be better off if they didn't have to deal with this anymore, or if they spent more time focused on these kinds of things. And that's the kind of stuff that we really, really have to watch for and be paying very close attention to, even the subtle things in our life that we don't think are changing that much, until all of a sudden we, are in a completely different direction. And I don't think enough attention is being put on that. And I think that is part of my commitment to why I'm trying to drill in and reflect on some of these other things, not just in this episode, but in every episode, because a lot of this stuff that's coming up, it's just easy. And I've got one planned for next week already that I'm like, this is one that is flying completely under the radar that nobody's paying attention to. And it's going to radically change society if we don't watch it, which might not necessarily be a bad thing, but it might not necessarily be what you want. And I think that's one of the things that we just have to be careful of. Now, granted, I won't turn this into a theological discussion, but again, going back to it, I think we just have to be really careful because these systems are built on human data and they're controlled and led by humans who, even the most well-intentioned people, are broken and are not necessarily making decisions that are in your best interest. And so we just have to be really mindful and careful of that. All right, let's pull this one up here that I thought was an interesting point about AI job redundancy. Now, this one I won't spend a ton of time on because I think it's something I've talked about quite a bit.
I get asked all the time if anyone's going to have a job left to do, because this is the disruption of intelligence. And whether it's people driving cars today, I mean, we saw the Tesla announcement of the robo taxis, whether it's accountants, lawyers, and everyone in between, or podcasters. Are we going to have jobs left?
Well, this question has been asked for 200 years. There were the Luddites here in Britain way back when. And inevitably, when these technologies come along, there's all these fears about them. Indeed, with the Luddites, there were riots and people, destroying the looms and all of this kind of stuff. But somehow we got through it. So my own view is that there will be a lot of job dislocation, but there will be a lot more jobs, not fewer jobs. And here's why. We have a demographic problem in the world, especially in the developed world, where we're not having enough children. That's well understood. Furthermore, we have a lot of older people, and the younger people have to take care of the older people, and they have to be more productive. If you have young people who need to be more productive, the best way to make them more productive is to give them more tools to make them more productive. Whether it's a machinist that goes from a manual machine into a CNC machine, or in the more modern case of a knowledge worker who can achieve more objectives. We need that productivity group. If you look at Asia, which is...
Okay. So he goes on a little bit more with that one. But I think, this position I don't think is new to anybody who's been following my stuff. However, what I thought was worth double clicking on was I really appreciated his explanations of why, because I think, a lot of times it's like, yeah, we're hearing this, but you hear some people that say, well, jobs are going to go away forever. Other people are saying, nah, there's just going to be more jobs. And a lot of times what isn't answered is, well, why? Like, either way, why? And I think he did a good job of describing some of the big macro societal trends that are going on, which, I mean, not in my household, but societally, people are having less kids. So we have less younger generations. We have an aging population. Things are getting more complicated, all this other stuff. So we actually need this and all this stuff. I really liked his point of job dislocation. And if you listen to it, he goes further into it. He acknowledges, and I have said this many times, there are going to be jobs that don't exist anymore, but that's not new. And I think overall what we're seeing is good, or we'll see a lot of good things. But I think this is why, and the reason I wanted to double click on it is everyone needs to be thinking about this. It's just not something anybody should be ignoring or going, well, my job's fine. It's not going to touch me, or it's not going to affect this or that, or I'll be dead by the time this stuff comes. It's like, no, it's all going to change in our lifetimes, in probably not even our lifetime, like in the very near future, if not already. And so, I think that's, and he goes on with this. And there's a part in here where he actually talks about AI being essential. I struggled with that as I think about it. I'm not going to go into it. I'm not going to pull up the clip, but I struggled with that a bit because he did go on to talk about how it's basically essential. It's critical to human existence that we have AI. Where I don't like this mindset, and I get it. He's run one of the biggest companies in the world. He's very much part of the, economic capitalistic machine of like, we just always have to get bigger and better and more and make all this other stuff. And I don't know that I would say it's essential, and I say that to encourage people who may just feel like, so what? Like, do I just throw myself over to where things are going? And I would say no, because I don't think it's essential. And I would disagree with him on that. I would not say it's essential. I think it is completely possible. And we have examples of people in society who have said, I reject this whole technological boom. I'm not going to participate in it. And they exist, like they make it. It's kind of, I relate it back to the work from home thing. Is not embracing it going to require more work? Yes. Is it going to mean you might have to be even better at your craft than you did before because you're competing now with people who are doing it with AI? Yes. Does it mean you might miss out on opportunities that exist? Because yes, there's going to be compromises and trade-offs. I don't know that I would agree with him to go so far as to say AI is essential for human existence, for humanity to survive. I really don't. Now, maybe on a macro level, you might say, well, with big governments and like this is just what I don't personally think it's essential. I don't think society would just crumble and fall apart. I think we'd have, a rethinking of it, but it didn't exist before. So to say it's essential for human, well, then how did we survive before? You know what I mean? It's one of those things that I don't go as far as he does. Now, again, this might be something where he and I would have a chat and he'd go, well, that's not really what I mean. I just mean with the trajectory we're on and where things are at, if you're going to survive, you have to do it. And I would just push back on that and go, no, I don't agree with that. Is it a harder road? Yeah, of course it is. Of course it's a harder road. Are you going to have to be that much more intentional? Sure. But is your life going to vaporize if you don't participate in the AI, transformation? No. And I can say that as somebody who would actually advocate, but you should participate in it. You should allow it to, enable you to do so. So I'm actually an advocate for participating in it. And even I wouldn't go, it's essential. I think that's overstating what it is and the value it has. And it's, all this other stuff. Okay. So here's the last clip related to technology that I'm going to pull up here. So let me just play this one because it has to do with kind of this whole how we protect from it and, our fear of adapting. So let me play this one and then we'll transition into the final section on humanity.
I wonder if this is the moment where humans couldn't see past around the corner. Because, I've heard you talk about how the AIs will turn in, they'll be agents and they'll be able to speak to each other and we won't be able to understand the language.
Well, I have a specific proposal on that. There are points where humans should assert control. And I've been trying to think about where are they? I'll give you an example. There's something called recursive self-improvement, where the system just keeps getting smarter and smarter and learning more and more things. At some point, if you don't know what it's learning, you should unplug it.
Well, we can't unplug them, can we?
Sure you can. There's a power plug and there's a circuit breaker. Go and turn the circuit breaker off. Another example, there's a scenario, theoretical, where the system is so powerful, it can produce a new model faster than the previous model was checked. Okay, that's another intervention point. So
okay. So there's one more I actually thought about. I may pull up one other clip that he talks about, or I may just talk about it. But I really, really appreciated this whole, how do we control AI? And I don't think he spends enough time going into the details of, and I think this is just where you'd spend an hour or a day just talking about this topic alone. But at the core of what he's getting at of, hey, where should we put stop gates? And I think this goes to something that I am concerned about as I watch the technological trend we're on right now. And even some of the things he brings up before of like, well, it makes our lives easier and all this other stuff. And, so he says so confidently, well, if we allow it to create a model that we don't even have time to check for it, then that's too far. But even that, I'd push back and go, well, didn't you also say that there's lots of things that are inconvenient and it should just be delightful? Isn't it inconvenient to have to review these models? So who decides that? Because somebody's going to say that's too inconvenient. We've decided that we're going to let AI just approve the next model before we have a chance to check it. Now, I agree that would be a horrible and stupid decision, but this is where the ethics and philosophy of how do we approach this technology that now is, in essence, becoming something capable of creating independently. And how do we manage and regulate that? And who decides what's convenient and inconvenient and what should be hey, this should be, there should be these mandatory checkpoints and validation points before things go forward. And he talks about, they had a conversation about, is it the end of humanity or whatever? And, he doesn't think it is, but he talks about this is a potential major risk. And I agree with it. And I think our tendency, going back to my earlier point of, we've got to be so careful, because if we are not relentlessly intentional about paying attention to this, it's going to just change things without us even knowing. And, it might sound like a big deal when Eric frames it this way of like, oh, I mean, obviously we wouldn't approve a model without human review that was just created by the AI. And I don't think anybody would just jump to that decision. But what I can see happening is you slowly start automating so many steps in the approval process that you don't realize that the vast majority of your human checkpoints are no longer human checkpoints. And you don't realize that, no, we had a human sign off on it at the end, but it's like, yeah, but if 90% of the checkpoints leading up to it were automated, did the human even have the decent ability to dig into what approvals had? And so it's more complicated than this. And this is why I appreciated his acknowledgement that there is a point we can go too far. I actually am even concerned when I see big tech leaders like this, seeing it as this, like, here's where that line is. Because as somebody who spends a lot of time deconstructing work and understanding how this stuff happens, and this is a risk for a lot of senior executives, you become so disconnected from the work, you don't understand the details of how the work gets done. And so you think that, Jill or Jane or Johnny, who brought you the report that said, I did the final review, you go, great, see, we did a human review before pushing the next model forward. You didn't realize that the 1,000 mini reviews that went up to that were all automated by AI because they were inconvenient. And this is where these dangers can come in. And this is where, when I see big tech leaders making statements like this, I get a little nervous, because I go, we sometimes want to oversimplify this stuff, and we don't think about it. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting, I won't play the clip. He talks about his fear of, the biggest fear about AI. And his point is, his fear is actually ironic in that his biggest fear is that we won't adopt it fast enough. And as he gets into it, I actually, even going back to my previous point, I actually agree with what he's saying. This is why I do the work I do, to try and increase people's digital acumen. It's why I try and help people understand the complexity of some of this stuff, so they don't end up just making decisions because they go, well, a human signed off on it. And it's like, yeah, there's more to it that you'd need to understand before you just say that that's okay. Because he talks about the slowness to adopt. And this is why I think, even if you are one of the people that I talked about earlier, that you say, I don't think AI is essential. Thank you, Christopher, for saying that. I'm going to avoid it. Okay. Do I think you still should, whether you like my content or not, should you be following this stuff? Should you understand it? Yes, you should, even if you choose not to do it. Similar to the work from home thing. If you are going to say we don't do remote work or we don't have hybrid work, you need to understand how work gets done and what remote work is and what the real trade-offs are, or you are making decisions without the right details. And that is a foolish, foolish, foolish risk. And so as he talks about the need for us to, I would challenge his point of we need to adopt it faster. I don't necessarily know we need to adopt it faster. I mean, maybe there's benefits, and I could argue that on both sides. But I think the awareness and critical thinking around it, which will tie to my next point. Yes, that 100%, I agree. We need to move faster with that. I don't think enough people are up to speed and understand what this is, which is why I'm so passionate and committed to the work that I do. Okay, enough on the technology front. There isn't anything in there where they get into the nitty gritty of like the latest models and like where they're going and some of this other stuff. And if you want to hear more on that, you can listen to some of my other content. I'm going to be talking about a really interesting model development next week, probably, that is very interesting with this. They don't get super technical with it. This one stays at a much higher level, which is why from a technology standpoint, it wasn't the vast majority of some of the stuff that I talked about. All right, so let's transition to the third and final component, which is the human experience. Granted, I think some of the things we've talked about up to this point touch on some of these, but I think there were some that go a little deeper, a little more societal that I think are worth bringing out. So the first one I want to bring up is this whole concept of your children's best friend being a computer. So let me play this.
Do you think they'll grow up okay?
I personally do, because I'm inherently an optimist. I also think that society begins to understand the problems. A typical example is there's an epidemic of harm to teenage girls. Girls, as we know, are more advanced than boys at those below 18. And the girls seem to get hit by social media at 11 and 12 when they're not quite capable of handling the rejection and the emotional stuff. And it's driven, emergency room visits, self-harm, and so forth to record levels. It's well documented. So society is beginning to recognize this. Now, schools won't let kids use their phones when they're in the classroom, which is kind of obvious if you ask me. So developmentally, one of the core questions about the AI revolution is, what does it do to the identity of children that are growing up? Your values, your personal values, the way you get up in the morning and think about life is now set. It's highly unlikely that an AI will change your programming, but your child can be significantly reprogrammed. And one of the things that we talk about in the book is what happens when the best friend of your child from birth is a computer. What's it like? Now, by the way, I don't know. We've never done it before. But you're running an experiment on 1 billion people without a control, right?
Okay. So couple things that I wanted to pull from that one in particular that I thought were noteworthy. The first one is this whole idea that, we don't have a control. We aren't really sure where this is going to go. I would challenge his assertion on that. And I think we have to be careful with that, because it can lead to us unintentionally having this idea of like, well, it's just an experiment and we're not really sure what's going to happen. So we just kind of got to let it play out and, take his either optimistic or pessimistic approach. His is more optimistic. You could take the pessimistic approach, like, oh, society's going to be over and children are destroyed for whatever. Or you could take his and go, we'll just adapt to it. And that's an oversimplification. So I don't want to represent him that way. But I don't think it's as unknown as he frames it up to be. Now, granted, for me, some of this is coming from my worldview. Okay. I talk quite a bit about the fact that I actually think the Bible is actually one of the greatest wisdom books to understand how to navigate this world that we're living in right now. And you might go, AI, what are you talking? AI had nothing to do. It doesn't matter. There are permanent, eternal truths that exist that don't change just because the new tech trend boomed. Like, there are things we know about this. And I talk about this a lot in my other content, which I think is why it's so important we're really intentional about this, because we do know how this movie ends. We know what happens if we let our kids be raised by computers and not have interaction with other humans. I can tell you how that ends, and I don't need the experiment to conclude, and I don't need a control group to tell you that. There are things we know about delegating certain aspects of our lives or just giving ourselves over to what we want, regardless of whether it's good for us or not. Like, there are things we know enough about to say, yeah, well, we can't just go, I don't know, this AI thing's a thing, and we're just going to have to let it run its course. And so I don't think that's what he's trying to get at there, but I don't think it's helpful when we adopt this idea that, like, this is just one big social experiment. And because what can happen, and we saw this with Facebook, or Meta, whatever, is it can lead to people not taking responsibility and accountability when things go wrong. Because you go, well, we didn't know, we just didn't know. And it's like, yes, we did. We know things about, the youth's cognitive development. We know things about all this other stuff. We know certain things from data points on these other things. Maybe we don't know specifically what it means if your kid's best friend is an AI bot. We might not have that empirical data, but we do know what happens when they're over dependent or exposed to technology too early. And again, I understand he's a leader in the big tech industry. The big tech industry wants to protect themselves. They have already had an attitude of like, hey, we just make it. What happens with it? That's not up to us. That's up to you. And I don't think that's helpful. And that's where I don't like when tech leaders they want all the benefit with none of the accountability. And that was a little bit what I felt like we was getting into when he starts talking about like, well, it's just a social experiment. Now, to be fair, he's not just saying like, throw caution to the wind and go without. Now, the other thing I would push back on what he said there is he's like, adults, they don't change their personalities. And he didn't say it like that. So I'll be careful how I represent. But he's like, as an adult, AI is not necessarily going to change who you are. A kid, on the other hand, might. I don't agree with that one bit. I think that is going back to my earlier point about the way AI is shaping us. I actually think our laziness and tendency to not be intentional and hyper-focused on what's going on around us. I actually think adults are just as vulnerable to have themselves radically change. Now, granted, is it on the same level as a child who hasn't had opportunities to establish, things? No, I'm not saying adults are identical to kids, but what I am saying is perpetuating this idea that adults are pretty much set in their ways. AI is low risk for them. Kids, those are the ones we should be watching, which right now I feel like is a cosmic redirect we're seeing happening in the tech industry. There's a lot more, and I'll talk about that in a future update. There's a lot more legislation around children and kids and access for kids and all this stuff. And it does feel a bit like a cosmic redirect of okay, that's where we'll concede. We'll concede, fine. Yeah, let's protect the kids. We can go around that. And kind of like cigarettes, right? Where it was like big tobacco was willing to go, all right, well, having a cartoon character is our primary thing. And candy cigarettes, I guess maybe we'll concede on that. But cigarettes, they're not really that bad. Adults are fine. They can make their own decisions here. Let's not overreach on this. And I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing with tech, where same thing, okay, fine. The like button's causing depression and suicide in teenagers. And so, okay, maybe we need to avoid some of that stuff. But adults, you are stuck in your ways and you know how to think critically. You do all this. You aren't going to be slightly diverted by AI subtly, even though we acknowledge it's just subtly changing all the cards and you don't even realize it's that's dangerous. It's dangerous. And I think we need to be really careful of buying into that. And I think there needs to be more accountability for tech companies and not just with kids. I think the fact we're focusing on kids, good. I'm all for it. Let's do more of that. I don't think it's that, not this. Okay. Second, and then I've got one more after this. He talks about TikTok and the addictiveness and how he would address it. So I want to address this because I think, again, it talks to some of the challenges. And maybe this is more of a business topic, but I think it's something that we need to understand as we think about these big tech companies.
As someone who's led one of the world's biggest tech companies, if you were the CEO of TikTok, what would you do? Because I'm sure that they realize everything you've said is true, but they have this commercial incentive to drive up the addictiveness of that algorithm, which is causing these echo chambers, which is causing the rates of anxiety and depression amongst young girls and young people more generally to increase. What would you do?
So I have talked to them and to the others as well. And I think it's pretty straightforward. There's sort of good revenue and bad revenue. When we were at Google, Larry and Sergey and I, we would have situations where we would improve quality. We would make the product better. And the debate was, do we take that to revenue in the form of more ads, or do we just make the product better? And that was a clear choice. And I arbitrarily decided that we would take 50% to one, 50% to the other, because I thought they were both important. So, and the founders, of course, were very supportive. So Google became more moral and also made more money, right? All of there's plenty of bad stuff on Google, but it's not on the first page. That was
okay. So I'm going to stop there. And so here's the point that I want to drill into on this, that I think is important for all of us as consumers to think, because this is a little bit of an insight into the mind of a big tech executive, somebody who's running one of the companies that is largely driving everything that, is going on societally. And what I understand is this idea that, there are times you have to make tough decisions, right? You might have to go, well, okay, like he said, do we go for revenue or do we just do it for the better good of society? And, you see companies who they want to do things that are just nothing but altruistic and they can't survive. And so what that can do is that can lead to this idea that, well, it's one or the other. And he even said, I arbitrarily chose 50%, like 50% is going to be towards revenue, 50% is just to make the company better, whether we make money off of it or not. And so I think, one, it's important that we see that and understand that about the technology that we have. It goes back to one of my earlier points, which is these tech companies are not altruistic. They're not out for you. Now, are they evil? No. And I don't think either of those two extremes is helpful. To think that there's a bunch of diabolical Eric Schmidt sitting in a boardroom going, ha ha ha, how do we ruin the kids? That's not helpful, but it's also not helpful to go, they're doing their very best. And it's always, they're making decisions in our best interest. And I don't think it's nefarious necessarily. I mean, listen to the guy talk and watch the whole interview and you'll see he's like, well, we're trying to make life delightful and we're trying to make it less inconvenient and we're trying to make money and it's like, oh, so it's complicated. It's extremely complicated. And I think this is where we need to have empathy for it, because I see things where people just, are shredding executive leaders at these companies like, well, they're people too. But I think we need to have more of this conscious awareness of it. Now, the other part that I would push back on is this idea that you have to choose. Well, do we make money or do we destroy people? And that's not what he's saying. But, hey, we've got this great new feature in our product. I mean, it might cause suicide and depression or, self-harm, things like that. But it makes us a bunch of money. So like 50%, we've done 60% on the good side. Let's just throw this one in that bucket because it's going to make a bucket loads of money. And I think that's one of the risks that we have if we're not careful, is that we can buy into this idea it's either or. And actually many, many, many times when you get to the root of my experience has been when you actually dig into the core, what are we really trying to accomplish here? I've actually found in more instances than not, it can be a both and. Might mean waiting, might mean taking a little more time, might mean cutting into some of your margins. Maybe you won't make quite as many billions of dollars, but you can still be profitable. And I think that's one of the downsides to this mindset that is very persistent in business owners, business leaders, is this idea of like, well, I mean, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And it's like, you actually don't. If you have to break a few eggs to make your omelet, maybe you should be asking, do I really need this big of an omelet? Do I really need that? And sometimes the answer is no. I mean, really, truly, if you have to break eggs to make the omelet, maybe you need to investigate eating something else for breakfast. And I think that's one of the things we all need to be really careful of it, because we can easily start to justify really bad behavior when we start to go, well, 50% of what I'm doing is good, so everybody's got to have a little bit of bad, right? And it's like, well, that's not productive. And that's obviously, yes, that is heavily influenced by my worldview, but that's also just my observation through natural law and a lot of the coaching and consulting and advising I've done, is that when we actually are willing to be patient, take the time to dig into things, actually understand what we're trying to achieve, it is possible to do both. It's possible to do both. It might look slightly different. It might not be quite as, profitable as we thought, but there's always a way to do it. It's just a lot of times we get really impatient or we get greedy or whatever. And then we go, wow, fine, just break a few eggs. It's fine. And I think we've broken enough eggs. We are already breaking eggs and we're going to break more eggs. Let's not perpetuate this mindset that as long as 50% of the eggs are making it into the pan, that's good. That's pretty good. Like, what are we going to then argue on ratios? Is 50-50 good? Is 40-60? Like, just stop. Let's take the time. Let's be patient. Let's put in the work to not have that happen. And it's possible. That's the thing. That's not just me being altruistic and going, this is how it could work. Like, no, it is possible. We just don't like to take the time to do it, or we just don't want to. All right. So the last one that I thought was really good, he spent a bunch of time talking about critical thinking. So this is let me pull this one up because here's where he talks about the importance of critical thinking and what that looks like. So let me play it here and then I'll respond to this. And then that's where I'll close.
And why is this skill of critical thinking so especially important in a world of AI?
Well, partly because AI will allow for perfect misinformation. So let's use an example of TikTok. TikTok can be understood. It's called the bandit algorithm in computer science, in the sense of the Las Vegas one-armed bandits. Do I stay in the bandit machine and I keep on this slot machine, or do I move to another slot machine? And the TikTok algorithm basically can be understood as, I'll keep serving you what you tell me you want, but occasionally I'll give you something from the adjacent area. And it's highly addictive. So what you're seeing with social media, and TikTok is a particularly bad example of this, is people are getting into these rabbit holes where all they see is confirmatory bias. And the ones that are, I mean, if it's fun and entertaining, I don't care. But you'll see, for example, there are plenty of stories where people have ultimately self-harm or suicide because they're already unhappy. And then they start picking up unhappy. And then their whole environment online is people who are unhappy, and it makes them more unhappy because it doesn't have a positive bias. So there's a really good example where, let's say in your case, you're the dad. You're going to watch this as the dad with your kid, and you're going to say, it's not that bad. Let me show you let me give you some good alternatives. Let me get you inspired. Let me get you out of your funk. The algorithms don't do that unless you force them to. It's because the algorithm.
Okay. So then he starts to get into more of the technical side of the why behind that. But I think the points that I wanted to pull out from that clip in particular was he starts to illustrate, he does a good job, I think, illustrating why critical thinking skills are so important as we move into this AI age. And actually, he, right before that, talks about the fact, and I firmly believe this, critical skills are something that can be taught, they can be learned, they can be grown, they can be developed. Absolutely. And so this clip then goes on to show, but why is that so important? And I think, one of the things that was interesting as I listened to that, several times, was the fact he's like, I don't really care if it's doing this, if it's fun and entertaining or whatever, but this thing is bad if it's not that. And this goes back to what I said before, that I think just from a human experience standpoint, we got to be really careful because somebody else is deciding what's good and entertaining versus, well, that's actually leading you to self-harm or things like that. And it's like, whoa. And again, I don't think he's even recognizing what he's saying as he's saying this, but I think this point of critical thinking, and I think another element of that is this human connection. So, he goes on in here multiple times, and I think concluding on this is a really valuable point, because if there's anything everyone should be doing right now, it should be focusing on developing your critical thinking skills. And he goes into an example of how he does it. And one of his examples is somebody tells him something, and I've said this multiple times. I've said, if you read something, don't just take it at face value. Go look it up. And he jokes about, he's like, I Google it. I mean, people would say something, I'd go Google it. And he's like, and then I would think about it. And then I'd talk to somebody else about it. And I'd make sure that it, worked and validated and all this other stuff. And, this is something that is not only really important to instill in our kids. I know I spend a ton of time with my kids, every night, just talking through things. We'll see some news headline and we'll talk about it, and then we'll look into it and we'll dig into like, where does that come from? Or what is the history behind this? And what has led to some of these things? Let's look at this from different news sources to see how they're reporting on these things. And some of these critical thinking skills, some are important. They all are critically important as we move into this age where, like I've said, that they said, and as I've reinforced through here, these algorithms are subtly influencing and changing what you see, changing what you're hearing, changing the kinds of things that are going on. And we have to be radically intentional about putting the time and effort into going, well, hang on, before my, amygdala response kicks in and I just get hijacked by this, let me think critically about what was just said. Let me think critically about why I'm even responding the way I'm responding. Why do I feel the way that I feel about this? And actually digging into that. And I think the other point that he hits on with, the example of the dad and the kid is we need each other, because he says it. AI is not going to pull you out of that rabbit hole. It's not. And he's like, unless you tell it to, which I agree. You can tell AI, hey, give me a contrarian view. And I do this regularly with stuff where I'm like, here's what I'm thinking. Tell me all the reasons why I shouldn't think this. What are the arguments against this? How might somebody who opposes what I think have to say on this? So you can do it. It's not that AI is incapable, but by his own words, it's not designed that way. It's designed to give you exactly what you want. And so, yes, can you have the self-discipline to push yourself? I mean, yes, you can improve in those areas. And you can use the tools to help you with that. But you also need other people. You need other people who know you, who can see you for who you are and can go, hey, Christopher, I'm seeing this change in you. Like, can we talk about that? What is going on here? And then when I go, well, it's because this, and just like the example he gave of the dad that goes, hang on a second. That's not really what's going on here. Let me give some additional context. And maybe after you've thought through it critically, you still feel the same way you do. You know what? That's fine. But at least think critically about it before you do it. And we need people to help us along that journey, because if we don't have that, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And, like I said, for me, my worldview is a huge point. I have a source of truth that I use as a filter for all this stuff. But, in the absence of that, even just good practice of building your critical thinking skills, building connections with other people who actually know you, who can help steer you when you're going down a path. I mean, there have been some times in my life where I've done some really stupid stuff, or was about to do some really stupid stuff. And I've had people in my life who cared about me who went, hey, Christopher, what are you doing? And I explained it because it seems perfectly logical to me. And then those people in my life go, can we talk about that for a minute? And they've challenged my thinking. They've pushed me to think harder. And while it's not fun, and while we might just go, it's just so much easier when I get to do what I want. Yeah, I know, but watch where that ends for you. So that's that. Like I said, this, what's funny is this ended up being close to the same length of the interview. But if you want, go check it out on Steven's channel. It is a really good interview. There's a lot more to it than I was able to get into on this. But overall, these were the pieces that I thought really stood out to me, especially around those three Venn diagram points of business, technology, and human experience. And so hopefully it's given you something to think about, something that you can think critically about as you think about what's going on in your world and the things that you're facing as we wrap up 2024. Next week, I will be back with just some updates on kind of my thoughts on those, but hopefully you found this helpful. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend.